All right, welcome back to our third session on the political unconscious by Frederick Jameson. Where we left off was a conversation of the three paradigms of analysis: the social, the political, and the historical. Let's talk about the social for a second. The social refers to an analysis of texts through a logic of social class. And the text that Jameson really pinpoints on page 84 is by Mikhail Bakhtin. And it's about this dialogical imagination that allows, you can see why Jameson likes it, because it allows us to think the coherence and fragmentation of social class through linguistic categories of what Saussure, in his introduction to structural linguistics, calls langue and parole. Right? So you're familiar with this if you've studied any Lacan, although Lacan has a completely different idea of parole. Parole for Lacan is like the Babel speech. It's the most important speech, actually. It's the speech that is found in the slips of your speech when you're doing free association. It's a speech that points to something, therefore, significant in your unconscious, something that you are attached to, even. But in a general sense, as we are examining it here, parole refers to the kind of coded speech that you could almost think of like common sense of a class that forms a certain ideologism, which is a neologism that Jameson creates. A neologism is just a word that refers to the invention of a fancy word. A neologism, therefore, is a word of jargon. So ideologism is a jargon word, but I think it's a good one. It means basically a point of a libidinal investment, but also an ideological investment, because remember, he's thinking Marx and Freud together. So every time we have a cathextion, or this cathextion idea from Freud, where a group kind of clings on to a point of meaning, that clinging on to it becomes almost symptomatic, right? And therefore it becomes something important for us to analyze. And he gives several examples throughout the text of different ideologies. One of them, of course, is ressentiment, which we will get to in a little bit. But an ideologism becomes the kind of focal point for the critic, for the reader, to isolate a point of ideological closure. Remember the importance of ideological closure. Why are we so interested in binary oppositions? Because they help us arrive at a point of kind of like non-meaning, or where the whole meaning system breaks apart. That becomes very important in this whole analysis that Jameson's putting forward, that history has to be understood as an absent cause. It has to be understood primarily through its effects. And in a moment, we will see that the object, the primary object that interests us the most, is indeed a new theory of what Jameson boldly calls cultural revolution. Cultural revolution, which I'm going to elaborate in a moment, because it's a very intricate argument, but it's reliant on Althusser's conception of the relationship between the coexistence of multiple modes of production within one mode of production, as well as social formations. And this led to that question of what we call the relative autonomy of the levels. And one of the questions there becomes, well, how are we thinking a point of determination or of negation within the Althusserian theory of a mode of production, or within a social formation? Because Jameson also recognizes that at this time, a lot of people, and I think this is actually very interesting for us to think about it, when we're raised in kind of like general American social justice education, we have the idea that there is something called the system with a capital S, right? Well, Jameson makes a clear point that, in fact, a lot of sophisticated thinkers, from Max Weber's idea of the kind of iron cage of bureaucracy to Michel Foucault's conception of biopolitics to John Baudrillard's conceptions of semiotic systems, even to Umberto Eco. Well, what does Jameson say? He says, well, in some sense, they have bequeathed this problem to us of thinking a totalized system of power, of regulation, of control. The problem with that being, dialectically, you can't think a point of determinate negation if you have this suffocating, omnipotent system. So that is why, if you look at page 95, 94, Jameson says the Marxist theory of mode of production is a way to think system dialectically that's much more robust and much clearer. Okay. But still, we have the Stalinist mechanistic conception of system, which was thinking it vis-a-vis base superstructure, which was content, right, to privilege a point of antagonism, a point of contradiction, most often the economic, right, as the locus by which the dialectical relation between the two levels would function, right? We now, with hindsight and also with the kind of ethical realization of the horrors of Stalinism, right, we can see that classical dialectical materialism had to face some type of reckoning, some type of historical reckoning of its philosophical foundations. This, I think, in a certain way, in a grand sense, is a way to understand the meaning of Althusser as a name in the history of Marxism. He's a thinker that helps us come around and face. He's one. He's one of the Marxist thinkers that allows us to. I think there's others. I think I would include Lukács here. So against a lot of leftists who would say Lukács remains caught within some mechanistic dialectical materialist conception, I would not say that. That's a side point, pardon the digression. But again, he says on page 95, quote, every social formation or historically existing society has in fact consisted in the overlay and structural coexistence of several modes of production all at once. Okay. What is interesting about this is it also, now let's cast a little bit of shade and a little bit of criticism on this idea for a moment. When we look at the example that Jameson brings to bear about feminism, I wanted to raise this with you. It's on page 100, where Jameson says, quote, if the subordination of women is bound up in an archaic mode of production, this means that rebellion against that archaic mode of production, which is already subsumed within modern capitalist mode of production, is in line with the Marxist understanding of social antagonism, contradiction, and so on. And I found that quite interesting. I also found it very, very comparable, very similar to a later claim that he makes in chapter 2 about how the de-centered subject of post-structuralism, including the quote-unquote schizophrenic subject, because it is deteriorating the composition or the integrity of the standard bourgeois subject, right? In other words, because it is taking on individualism, even if it doesn't have a concrete praxis located in class, in a class formation or strategy. What does Jameson say? He says this is also in line with Marxism. Okay. So what we have is the confluence and the development of a kind of image of, this is 1981 here, right? That he's writing this text, of what has subsequently come to be called cultural Marxism. Okay, those two examples point us to what we mean when we say cultural Marxism. Now, critics of cultural Marxism, what will they say? What will they say? Well, they will say that this mode of thinking is too loosey-goosey. It is not, it's not well, you could say in a classical Marxist sense, perhaps it's giving sway to a type of ultra-leftism, perhaps, or it's giving way to a form of anarchist revolt, which the liberal status quo could quite easily subsume on its own terms? This would be the big question. And it is a bit of a contradiction because earlier, okay, earlier, as we saw last time, what did Jameson say about post structuralism in the Deleuze Guattari point about American socialism? Remember what he said? He said, well, the problem with their critique of socialism is that it's francophonic. It's based in France. France, yeah, France has a problem with big molar bureaucratic Marxist institutions. We could only wish that that was our problem. We have a complete poverty of that. We have the opposite of that. And so I felt that this is very interesting and a sign perhaps of Jameson's own praxeological ecumenicism, the fact that he's saying, well, no, Marxism needs to be about this big umbrella tent of thinking all forms of resistance at once. Now, I'm only playing devil's advocate here. I actually think there is a grain of truth to that. But I also have the kind of fortitude to recognize that in the field of political domain, we also have a history that we have to reckon with. So that's something for us to discuss. And I know that's a sort of a finer point, and even most definitely a controversial point. So yes, as we mentioned, just to review, Poulantzas allows, building off of Althusser, this idea of structural coexistence of multiple modes of production at one given conjuncture. Okay. This idea of Vorstellung and Darstellung is an important distinction about the meaning of representation, these two German words that we see both in Freud and in Marx. Vorstellung is defined as, just as a sort of reminder to you, an image of an object that is in memory. It's a kind of cognitive object. It's something that is recalled as a cognitive object of memory. That's Vorstellung. Darstellung is the being of the object itself as representation. And it is therefore something which is kind of like an objectified point of representation. It is that latter one. It is that latter one that the object of cultural revolution, which Jameson at the end of the introduction, okay, at the end of the introduction, he says this is sort of the focal point of the new modality of literary criticism, okay? And that cultural revolution allows us to apprehend, right, multiple things. It allows us to apprehend historical modes of transition across genres. It also allows us to apprehend the contrast and the difference between form and content and how they mold into one another. Say, for example, as we will see in the next chapter, this approach allows Jameson to show how forms of romance literature basically evolve away from an analysis of causality centered on the individual agent. That's the key point. Because again, in both the mechanistic, remember going back to our very first session, the three forms of historical causality, in both mechanistic and in expressive causality, they're kind of agent-centered. They're kind of individual-centered, right? And one of the things that the Althusserian mode of structural causality allows us to analyze is a de-agent, a kind of removal of the human agency from the field of causality. And that's extremely interesting. And that actually is where the social becomes into play, you see, because when a class speaks through you ideologically as a character in a book, is it really you that is speaking? Right? Can we really say that's a human agency speaking? Right? Or rather, are you sort of spoken through? Is that character spoken through social forces? Right? That's the point of Darstellung. That's the point. That's the point at which we would define this object. Does that make sense to you? Because then, in that sense, it's not from the heroic whims of a great personified individual that expresses an inner essence or worldview of the class. No, it's from a depersonalized field of social forces that express through the characters. So it's kind of like an inversion, right? It's an inversion of the way the meaning is working in the text, okay? Um, okay, so let me read this quote on 97 about cultural revolution so we are clear on this, because again, I cannot stress how important this is, I think. It's coming at the end of the first chapter. Okay. Cultural revolution allows us to work out in the whole course of social life, uh, which proceeds here, and which is therefore latent and implicit in pre revolutionary social experience and made visible as the latter's deep structure. Moments of truth, whereby we are basically revealed. What is revealed is cultural revolution, right? And these moments bring up a kind of surface, which is a permanent. This is an important point. What he's talking about is that within social historical life, right, at any given time, the sort of call of the political unconscious for the reader, for the critic, is to be able to locate this permanent struggle that exists between the various coexisting modes of production at any given time, right? The task of cultural and social analysis is to show how cultural revolution is in a constant constitutive basis by which empirical textual objects know their intelligibility. And that is why, when you locate this object, it is beyond synchrony and diachrony. It has touched what Ernst Bloch, in the Principle of Hope, I believe, calls non-synchronous development. Now, Jameson then makes a quick pivot to the opening of Marx's Grundrisse, where there are three epistemological levels laid out, very similar to Althusser's three layers that we looked at in For Marx. And what he's trying to say is that science, as Marx understands it, is most in line with this idea of the capacity to locate that, let's call it cultural object. But first, let's review the three levels. The first is the simple empirical notation of a particular point of data in the world. That's first level of empirical knowledge. The second level is what Jameson says is the conquest of abstraction, whereby this empirical data point is now capable of being categorized according to the categories of understanding. And this level of knowledge is where Jameson sort of intimates mechanistic knowledge. Remember part one of the structures of causality? It's kind of where that's all that it can do, right? That's level two, kind of static categories of understanding of empirical realities raised up. Level three is the transcendence of abstraction through the introduction of the dialectic. And this is achieved by moving from the classification of the categories to a new perception of the way that they have a dynamic and contradictory coexistence in a given cultural moment. And the example that he ends that with is the ideologeme itself. The ideologeme, this point of ideological investment by a group, which is expressed through text, which we will see examples of as we read. Once you're capable of locating and elevating the ideologeme, you can then think at that third level, right? You can think that would be like an objective, is to think that dialectically. So the text is now part of a field of social forces, right, that make up an ideology of form, okay, at this level. And at this level, form is now comprehended as content, okay? And he gives the example of Stendhal's The Red and the Black to show how the forms of romance clash with the when was The Red and the Black written? Well, it was written right at the moment, and you can see this all over the text, of a huge transition in the mode of production from feudal to the early industrial revolution period, right? It's written right upon the victory of Napoleon and the ascension of Napoleon, and it's like this whole um, coming off of the ancien regime, but not fully, right? So what he's trying to say is that the Marxist mode of analyzing a text like Stendhal's The Red and the Black would have to be able to penetrate into these contradictory forms to locate uh, points at which contradictory points of class are speaking through the characters, etc. But then he adds another layer to it, and he says Marxism can do more than that. And this is where he has his conversation in the next chapter with Northrop Frye, where he says what Marxist literary criticism allows us to do is to actually show the way that these ideologies that are expressed through characters and so on in texts um, are also intimately linked with concrete social and political contradictions. And so, in that sense, the quote unquote philosophy of history, the grand project of historicism, what we're doing here is fully in line with that and in dialogue with that and contributing to that. It's not as if literary criticism is its own disciplinary appendage. No, no, no. What the political unconscious, and I think what he's opening up, is not only a kind of rapprochement, but I would argue that he's actually allowing Marxist historicism almost to be like rethought or refoundationalized in a certain way. Um, okay. So this is why history hurts. What does it mean when you say history hurts? Well, it's because um, we don't have the leisure, right? We don't have the easy way out, right? In which our mode of historical causality can be understood through the rise and fall of heroic agents, but rather we have to situate our reading within this complex situational historical field, right? And ultimately, history is born from an absent cause. It can only be grasped through its effects. But those effects, going back to this notion of Darstellung, at moments gel into objects of analysis. And those become points where we can think changes in history and all of that. Okay. That is we've spent quite a while talking about the first chapter, but I think it's worth doing. I'll pause there and see if there's any thoughts before we move to chapter 2 on magical narratives. Um, and I don't know if Conrad is here in the house or not.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Hello there. How are you?
Ah, good, good.
Excellent. Okay. So, feel free to raise hands if there are thoughts, because I do want to move and say a few things about chapter 2 on magical narratives, because, I'm going to have someone on our program who teaches at the American University of Beirut, um, a scholar by the name of Angela. I forget Hartuneum. I forget how to pronounce her last name exactly, but she specializes in socialist realism. And I think that socialist realism really gets a bad rap. And I was reading Jameson's book on socialist realism, The Antinomies of Realism, and I noticed something. He doesn't really read a lot of Soviet socialist realist philosophers too much, which I found to be a bit unfortunate. Um, Lukács seems to be one of his primary. There's a few others. Um, so, but why do I say that? Because precisely Jameson is making this claim, right? And I think this is a very, very compelling claim. It's one that he's known for, I think one that he's famous for, which is the following claim. Late capitalism has reified realism to such an extent that the new genre that is paramount, that is paradigmatic, if you will, is no longer realism, but is romance. It is romance. Why is that? Well, it's because social forms no longer have a relationality to freedom whereby the reality principle that they emit would be tolerable enough, right, for our legitimate investment in them. Hmm? In other words, the thinking of freedom has to have a certain distance from reality. And this is a way we define the capitalist social life, okay? And that this then informs, in a very broad sense, the direction of artistic production, okay? Um, Now, what the fuck is romance as a paradigm or romanticism as a paradigm? Okay. Well, first of all, it relies upon a world. It is, uh, but it is not utopian. It relies upon a world, but it is not utopian. What does that mean? Well, it means that romanticism seeks a kind of rapport with reality, but a slight alteration of reality, not necessarily an overthrow of reality. Hmm? That is why uh, it functions with tragedy and comedy as its two avatars, primarily. Okay. Now, the conversation about the phenomenology is very, very compelling. You know, this idea that most romantic paradigms induct you into some kind of gestalt. You know, this concept of a gestalt, right? Which is a kind of a world which is very close to our world, but slightly other than our world, right? This is a kind of very, very common motif in romantic art. Um, and Heidegger, in fact, becomes the paramount thinker of the way that we can conceive of this worldly situation. So he says that um, a definition of romance in distinction to realism is that in romance, the inner worldly objects, landscapes, a forest, a mansion, etc., are all transformed into folds in space that are discontinuous pockets of homogeneous time, right? They have a heightened symbolic closure such that they become tangible or perceptual vehicles for the experience of a world itself, right? Therefore, he has this very clunky phrase, which I think is a nice phrase, which is that the genre of romance texts is one in which you experience the worldness of a world, or the worldness of a world reveals itself to the reader. Okay. I felt that the Thomas Paine Joan Crying of Lot 49 example of the protagonist is very interesting, Oedipa Ma, in the sense that she is a figure who is uniquely alienated in a world that is very close to our own, but also slightly awry or slightly different than our own. And it is our identification with her point of alienation from not being fully included in that world. So it's kind of like estrangement effect, as we saw with Brecht in our last study group, is very common motif. But obviously in postmodern literature, that takes on a very different form. Why? Why? Well, because realism is no longer hegemonic. In the Brechtian period, realism was hegemonic, you could say, right? So therefore, estrangement has to be completely rethought. Okay. Okay. Um, so yes. So world designates um, uh, this idea that um, Sense cannot normally be an object of perception in its own right. Events take place within an infinite space that extends infinitely beyond any particular momentary situation, setting, or panorama. In a sense, experience itself. This, I think, is the key point. Experience itself becomes the site of contradiction. It cannot be contained, it cannot be represented, etc. It becomes contested, right? So you have a unique alienation from your own experience, right? Why? So Jameson calls this romance. That's fucking fascinating. Why is he calling? He's calling this as a big paradigm of a historical shift. Now, Nietzsche emerges as a very seminal thinker in this moment. Why? Because behind romance hinges a binary, a binary between primarily an ethical nature, which is between good and evil. And Nietzsche offers a sort of, you could say, a way. Okay, let's keep this in mind. If Nietzsche, along with Freud and Marx, is a thinker who contributes to modernity precisely because he is a great hermeneutic of suspicion, he gives us a hermeneutic of suspicion. I think this is a good way to understand what that means, which is that Nietzsche helps us allows us to see the ideology in a ethical investment of good and evil. In other words, he can help us see the fiction of it. And this then leads to a kind of a crisis whereby we have, and this is a huge, huge motif in the 1990s, a crisis of otherness. Why would that be a crisis of otherness? Well, because if evil is fictional, but the presence of the other, whether that be cultural other, foreign other, class other, etc., still riddles my psyche and my body, right? Still creates some problems for the body politic. But they're not but the cause of that is purely born from their proximity to us, you see, right? That represents a collapse in the binary of good and evil. In the binary of good and evil, it collapses. So romance also, and I think this is very important. I didn't mention this. Why also is romance so central at this moment of the birth of what Jameson will later call the postmodern? Well, as one of my favorite poets recently said, Anne Boyer, she said, no poet has ever gotten out of the paradigm of romance since the Industrial Revolution, because romance is distinctive to the capitalist mode of production. And moreover, romance is, and I think we'll see later how it relates to utopia. It's slightly different. In some sense, romance is about a salvific paradigm, by the way. I didn't mention that, but this is essential. In other words, undergirding the action is some type of salvation. Some type of redemption is always at work in romance. Okay. Um, this is what Northrop Frye calls the quest romance, right? Which is the hero's search can be understood as the search ultimately of a reunion with their own desire, which we saw last time as at a collective level as libidinal transfiguration. Right? But the idea is that what romance is trying to satiate, what it's trying to achieve, is a better rapport with reality. So again, we're brought back to realism and romance, and they're very, very close to one another, by the way. Okay. I'm almost done here, comrades. I just want to say a couple of more things. We have on page 117 an incredibly important point, right? Which is that the ideology, okay, the ideology, which we talked about a moment ago, you could almost say the task of the Marxist literary critic, right, would be to read ideologies, right? So what's an example of that? Let's say we take proletarian realism from 1910 through 1930, and we read all of the most important novels of proletarian realist authors in America. And we map a Gramscian square onto them, and we identify the ideologies across these novels. Yeah. Jameson is saying here on page 117, this is a contribution to what he calls social praxis, because this will help us locate true social contradiction that exceeds the text. It's not just a purely textualist thing, right? Right? Um, he does take some issue with Nietzsche on page 117, 118 that is important to note, which is that Nietzsche's two solutions, right, to the um, ethical, right, to the ethics of good and evil, um, on the one hand is a criticism of ressentiment, and on the other is the Ubermensch. And uh, Jameson sort of, I have the sense that he has a feeling that Nietzsche's um, politics is not in line with Marxism, because it's kind of built on this austere, community, and it's maybe a bit outmoded for him. But nonetheless, Nietzsche is essential as a critic of a hermeneutic of suspicion who can help us locate these points. And he will return when we get to a conversation on ressentiment in subsequent chapters. Um, there's a huge conversation here about the mythology of the folktale by a Russian author by the name of Frop, which I went and I researched, and you guys can look into it. It's basically kind of like what I just said about proletarian realism. And I think that's actually a very profound research agenda for yourself. If any of you are literary scholars, he went back to every single folktale told in Russian history, and he basically schematized them. And he ended up influencing Claude Levi-Strauss and Gray-Moss himself. Okay. And he came up with like 37 variables, like laws of these folktales. It's all quite elaborate. Okay, final point is going back to what I said before about Jameson and the impasses of 1980s post-structuralism and academic cultural Marxism, even though I know that's a pejorative and I apologize. He says, quote, listen to this. Tell me if you agree. Jameson says, from Marx's point of view, the experience of the decentering of the subject, essentially psychoanalytic, which are essentially psychoanalytic, and which have been devised to map it, are to be seen as the signs of the dissolution of an essentially bourgeois ideology of this subject and of psychic unity or identity. But we may admit the descriptive value of the post-structuralist critique of the subject without necessarily endorsing the schizophrenic ideal as its destination point. Okay, so we may admit the descriptive value. So he's sort of hedging his bet a little bit here. In other words, he's saying capitalism and schizophrenia, Baudrillard, all of these kind of semioticians, post-structuralist modes of thinking, causality, Deleuze, etc., may give us value as like descriptions of social decay and fragmentation. But he's also flirting with kind of this idea, I feel at the same time, that and this is something that is like Michel Cluscart 101, where there's almost like this mistake in description with praxis, or the sense that description uh, gives us that something in reification and alienated, fragmented, schizoid accelerationist becoming is intrinsically liberating. I think this is deeply flawed. I want to say one thing as a final point. There's a great book by a junior scholar who's an independent scholar that I respect very much by the name of Tony McKenna. And his book is called The War Against Marxism, Reification and Revolution. Okay. I'll put a link to it in the chat when I'm done talking, but I was reading it recently, And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that in Jameson's revision of the Lukaschian theory of reification, McKenna reminded me of something essential, which I neglected to mention in my last two sessions, our last two sessions, which is that the reification of the proletariat is born from not a generalized experience of exploitation of the working class, but is born from a very specific uh, form that alienation takes vis-a-vis the labor power, the category of labor power. And he says that uh, it's not class that's missing in Jameson. It's the centrality of labor power and the way that category was so essential to any conception of reification for Lukács. Okay, so I'll stop there and turn it over to Conrad for his thoughts and reflections and comments. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so I want to raise to start maybe, and I'm not going to say too much because I think Daniel's done a great job recapitulating a lot of what we're doing. But I want to suggest that there can be an issue with respect to the way that Jameson um, conceptualizes narrative in terms of how we're supposed to apply it as a metric for judgment. So if we go to this passage that Daniel's discussing, right, in which Jameson, sort of nods toward the schizophrenic conception of the subject or the deconstruction of the bourgeois subject within postmodernism, um, it's it's an interesting um, impasse because at that moment, of course, you could read this as Jameson saying, as a complete dismissal, right? And I'm not talking so much about the schizophrenic thing, but his focus on the deconstruction of the bourgeois subject, you could, and I think many people would tend to read as a dismissal of Marxist humanism, right? But then we have another side to this, right? Which is that if you look at the way that, Jameson's entire analytic, the way it's structured, it's based on history as an absent cause, right? And then the fundamental unrepresentability of that, e.g., the need on some level for narrative, right? The need for a kind of expressive causality, right? And there's a very interesting passage here where he actually talks about, Marxism and its sort of incapacity to realize a fully scientific image of itself. And I'll refer to this. Hegel's designation of the ultimate horizon of historical and collective understanding as absolute spirit still fatally projects the afterimage of the individual consciousness of the philosopher sage. And the classical aporia of the Marxist vision of revolutionary change, objective social law or voluntarist and Leninist praxis, suggests that those locked into it have been unable fully to realize a vision of history in which the voluntarist actions of individuals and individual groups are themselves grasped as objective forces in history. Moreover, Marx and Engels' attempt in the manifesto to formulate their vision of historical inevitability by way of a mechanical alteration of older ethical categories, the bourgeoisie is both progressive and dehumanizing, both a necessary and a humanly intolerable stage in social development, sufficiently conveys the hold of the older ethical categories in their language. Yet these historical texts are not the last word on the dialectic itself, but merely prodigious anticipations, et cetera, right? And I think this itself raises an interesting problem, if you will, because one of the issues here is that Jameson obviously defines the scope of narrative in an extremely broad fashion, right? In a way, because he says like Marxism, almost in its entirety, like he's not even just talking about expressive causality. He's like Marxism is a narrative in the sense that narratives, right? Like even avant-garde narratives, like anything, technical texts, social scientific texts, right? They're all attempts to decode the absent cause of history. But this also raises the question of how we apply this again as a principle of evaluation. Because, if we look at what is inevitably kind of the case that we find within revolutionary movements, for example, this tendency to humanize, right? This tendency to cast a particular class of people as being evil, if you will, right? So we see this with, Maoism, right, in terms of the way that landlords, right, were kind of demonized in a lot of respects, right, well beyond the injunction of a kind of formal science, right, and this was used as a way to galvanize people, right. Yeah, enemies of the people. There you go. Yeah, but then the question is like, would Jameson be critical of that, right? Because on one hand, you could say, okay, like doing something like that, is on one hand, you could say if you were to do something like that, that would be to depart from a more scientific conception of Marxism, right? Um, but on the other hand, you could say that, you know, any, in a sense, conception of Marxism, right, by virtue of what it is already such a form of narrative representation, right? If this kind of makes sense. So I think there's a question here of how we would, if we just interpret everything as a kind of narrative, how do we discriminate between levels, right? Is it possible to say that, oh, we're deviating from a kind of a more objective conception of Marxism, or would it already be the case that that objective conception of Marxism is in of itself a narrative, right? So I don't think that point is necessarily so clarified. Um, yeah, actually, what do you think?
I mean, I don't know if this is like authoritative, but like the example that comes to mind is like in structural anthropology, Levi-Strauss will like make this argument about like he's like, what do I mean by language, or you need linguistics to do like any social science? He's like, is kinship language? And he's kind of like, it would be an absurd non-materialist position to say that there is sort of a substantial kinship, blood relation as an essence that like wasn't cultural. That like, I mean, at that level, I guess you're right, like where, I mean, then all analysis of levels sort of has to go through a sort of cultural analysis. But also, I mean, I don't see how you can hold the other position without lapsing into like a very strange sort of idealism about blood and family and other things.
Interesting. Yeah. Drew?
Yeah. So I mean, I think I would just point in the first meeting I said that this was his position, which is that it's a Marxism is a narrative structure, and I think that this is a position I think of like within the materialist tradition, there's always been a pessimism, right? And I mean, you start with someone like Leopardi, but you can go all the way to Althusser, right? Like the entire point of Althusser's idea of injunction about ideological state apparatuses is that even socialist states are ideological state apparatuses. And in some ways, Althusser abandons the idea that you will ever have a state without a state apparatus. And he sort of has this idea that we're always remaining within an ideological effect. So I think that what I'm hearing in Jameson as well is that kind of pessimism, but it speaks to what I think Jameson points out in the first session, which is the constant process of ideally of Marxism to overcome itself. And I would argue, like, if you look at the example you gave of the Maoist period and Mao's injunctions in the 1940s about enemies of the people, etc., the Mao and the Communist Party of China were repeatedly required to rein in some of the excesses of the population that came out of that rhetoric, right? So, for
Hmm.
example, in the landlord campaign, there were massive injunctions that came out about what they called the poor peasant line, which was actually just engaging in indiscriminate violence against landlords of the worst varieties. So I think that that's where, in practice, whether it's politics or literature, I think you're always, and just one more, and then when it comes to even Marxology, I think a lot of people have pointed out the limitations of Marx's own writings on slavery or racism, and that's part of the enrichment of Marxism too, supposedly. So I think that the question. So it seems to me that what Jameson is pointing out, the narratology of Marxism, I think it makes sense. Like insofar that and even then, the moment of scientificity is an attempt which is then bounded to fail, which then starts the process again. And this is where in the first meeting, I said, like, I think that like what's interesting about Jameson is that he's repeatedly avoiding what I would consider a kind of Marxist triumphalism, which I think, like, I
Hmm.
think what was it, Eagleton's book called Marx is Right, right? Like, I think I think that
Yeah.
this
Hmm.
is what he's always trying to avoid, and I see that as coming out of a kind of a material. But let's not even call it Marxist. Let's call it just materialist, sort of pessimistic trend, which it exists, and I think is an important one.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, well, I think so. I think the real question here with respect to narrative is it the case that we're just trying to, become as objective as we can? Right? Is the goal, just to represent the absent cause of history with the maximal degree
But this goes back
of
to this becomes the function of theoretical versus practical, right? So in the theoretical, we want to go towards the scientific because and that's why you need that's Mark like Althusser's sort of scientificism. But on
yeah,
the
yeah,
level, but as we talked about in the last group, when it comes to practical politics, I don't think that he actually has that drive towards um, de-ideologization as an absolute, like a kind of reification or something like that. I think a unreification of the proletariat. I think that that's where you have to make a choice between a kind of Althusserian pessimism or something that
yeah.
is a much more Hegelian humanist version of Marxism, which is the overcoming of man.
Yeah, yeah.
And
And in a way, Jameson wants to do both, right? But like what I find a little bit troubling about the analysis is the way that that distinction isn't formalized in the same way. So we're kind of left to wonder, right? Like, is he advocating like a quotient of humanism, whereby narrative would just be a feature of how we communicate in that way that has to be accommodated, right? Or is he saying we should just go in the direction of being, as representational as we possibly can? Right. I think that's an interesting.
No, I would say it's not a decision that's abstracted from Jameson's own placement in history. Isn't it also the case that he's constantly talking about um, paradigms of conceptual paradigms like this that you're talking about,
Mhm.
philosophical systems, right?
Mhm.
As shifting their valence of relevance based upon conjunctures.
Mhm.
Why else would realism no longer have the purchase that it does, for example? Why else would Jameson, in an email to us, say that Lukács's Destruction of Reason very well could become one of the most important books on fascism, if the conditions are
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So I feel like there's also that going.
Just to say
Aaron?
one
Yeah.
last line, and
Oh,
I'm so
actually, yeah.
sorry, Aaron, but I mean, just to what Conrad was saying, like, I don't think he means narrative in the sense of like representations that people are doing representations, but in the sense of like there's like an always already sort of symbolic staging to events. So like Trump coming into power, like what if fascist rally in Charlottesville means? And it's I think narrative is sort of just the staging, right? Like, and there's I'm not sure what history would be without the staging, right? Like what's history with no tragedy or comedy? So I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, in that sense, like I'm not sure how you do get at this like scientific kind of rigorous sense.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's it, right? Because like if it's always staged, then it's always staged, right? And we're not really left with like, clear indices with respect to what should we be driving at. But I do take Daniel's point as well that invariably it's conjunctural, as well as Drove's relation to it of the categories of Althusser. Aaron?
Yeah, well, actually, I think some of this has just been answered by the conversation that happened a little bit, but I was going to ask you a kind of open question, which is that I've had a little bit of difficulty parsing, and I think Daniel raised this in his comments, sort of Jameson's relation to subjectivity, and in particular how it relates to the master narrative or the kind of narrativization process. Like, is for Jameson the construction of a master narrative simply taking sort of objective social agents or taking objective subject positions and then narrativizing them in a sort of a certain way to make sense of them? Or is it in fact that the sort of process of narrativization actually does something constitutive to the subject? Like how I couldn't really parse how he comes down on that. And I think part of it was because he draws from so many sources that seem to be in tension with one another on the question of the subject because he has all of these deaths, the different traditions. And so this question of subjectivity the whole time that I've been reading this has kind of been difficult for me to. I don't know if that question makes sense, but in terms of like how that relates to the master narrative.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So like I'm not again, like I'm not a Jameson scholar, but like I definitely think that what he's saying here is that like the constitution of subjectivity as we understand it is part of a process of narration, right? So when he refers to like the bourgeois subject, like this could be indexed to works of philosophy and literature, and it would ultimately be part of an entire narrative with respect to how reality functions, right? You know, in terms of like you know, the individual, you know, individual psychology, right? The sort of agential power you have in the world and all of these questions. You know, and it would ultimately go back to Althusser's. I mean, Jameson might have a different um, iteration of it, right? But it ultimately goes back to Althusser's sort of schematic explanation in Marxism and humanism that, you know, this is something that's constructed in order to justify the exploitation of, you know, or commodification of labor power, right? In the last instance. So, yeah. Is that maybe helpful at all? Um, Charles?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I got a bit lost after page 117 where he made that really major claim at the top about ideologies. You know, he's spoken of Nietzsche rewriting his rewriting of ethics and how it's suggestive of a theory of sedimentation that seems important, but he says it's mythic, you know. And then running up to that point, it's we seem to see um, what seems to be an attempt to pry dialectics free of ethics or the ethical. I mean, he launches he launches out of remarks on historical re-examination of the binary opposition itself. He goes through Derrida and then Nietzsche, whose solution in the Übermensch or the eternal return is like unsatisfactory or even intolerable, you know, to make the claim that the transcendence of ethics is realized by other genres, you know, say tragic or comic, and ultimately by dialectic itself, but one that needs to be like disentangled from ethical categories. And then we see, you know, he implicates Hegel and Marx in that entanglement, you know, saying they aren't the last word on dialectics. And so I guess my question is, it's like granting an ethical core to dialectics, you know, it's like a vibration of sorts that running back from Marx through Hegel, you could say to Aristotle and Plato, it would seem the making of a kind of strong claim. So, I mean, to the degree that he's trying to push ethics aside. So, but when he uses terms like social praxis or collective practice or the ideologeme as an imaginary active response,
Mhm.
um, how is like how is that not some primary core ethical act, or how is a field of social forces not what Hegel in places calls ethical substance? You know, I was caught up in all those questions, but I just really got in the weeds after that and just completely got lost so far.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's like that's a tough question. I mean, I think that really, I mean, obviously, you know, this is when we're talking about the polemical aspects of the text, right? So there's a very like, you know, the correctness of a kind of scientific Marxism is sort of presupposed in a certain way within this analysis. But I want to add as well that, you know, I think that it's a little bit more complicated than trying to liquidate ethics from the dialectic. Now, of course, Hegel himself said that ethics is ideology. So I think that it wouldn't be as simple as there being an ethical core that, you know, Hegel unambiguously recognizes or embraces. But it's important to understand that, you know, Althusser was anti-dialectical, right? So while Jameson subscribes to the idea of a kind of you know, scientificity of history, right? History is an absolute cause. At the same time, the very sanctioning of the dialectic within his analysis stems from his positive appreciation of narrative, right? So the dialectic becomes a way of recognizing, right, or narrativizing in a certain sense, objective um, patterns or aspects of reality. And in that way, along the lines of what we were saying earlier, right, there's a sense in which the ethical, however it might diverge in certain respects from a purely scientific representation of history, would actually be necessary, right? And this is like something we find in Althusser too, right? When he says like, because Althusser, people always, this is one of the misconceptions about Althusser, right? People always think like, oh, Althusser was just completely opposed to any conception of, any expression of humanism. But, that was a theoretical position. It was not a strategic position. And moreover, he recognized that the moment you're doing any kind of politics, you need a kind of normative dimension because, science isn't going to exhaust that, right? So I don't think it's the case that his conception of dialectic is premised on a refusal of ethics in the way you're describing. I just think it's that the absent cause of history situated over here,
Yeah.
right, is what's scientific, and then there's a representational.
I want to jump in on the Nietzsche point though.
Yeah,
The Nietzschean point is rejected because he sees it as grounded in a situational context which reproduces a mythical outcome. Like the Nietzschean operation is based on almost like a resolution to the fiction of the binary of good and evil from this kind of Christian instantiation, which is then funneled back through a mythical theory of tragedy in the Nietzschean sense. Like, and then that is then lauded or valorized or celebrated. And that is how you can get a Nietzschean treatment of the ideology. But he says, I'm not really interested in that. And you'll notice then the next page, he then says, we want to approach the ideology through a more Althusserian analysis of the imaginary investment. So he's using kind of an ideological apparatus model of Althusser on page 118, where he then gets into this shift, building off of that Russian critic that I mentioned before, Fropp, who he's very celebratory of, about the shift in folklore and as well as the shift that we also see in romanticism, right? So he's saying that Nietzsche is sort of pointing to something, but ultimately it's not the model that he wants to work with. I don't see much dialectics there, by the way. I just want to add that in terms of his then sort of ideological approach to the analysis of ideology. Dialectics is mentioned, but you would have to show me exactly where that is thrown into the mix. I don't see it myself, by the way. I don't know, Charles, if you wanted to jump back in on that. Because in other words, I don't think that he's posing a Hegelian solution against Nietzsche's ethics.
I'll try to find it in the text, but there was a place where he mentions tragedy and comedy, and then I think
Yep.
it's on the next page, he says something about dialectics itself can make this transcendence. But I'll see if I can find it real quick.
Great, yeah. Matilda,
by the way, did you see that? Did you see the, I love the explanation. Did you guys catch that? The explanation for why tragedy became more popular in a European context, starting from the 12th century onwards. That was some really good armchair Marxology. I like that. If I understood properly, his explanation is that basically the categories of good and evil,
yeah,
which would have been more associated with a kind of a properly feudal representation
right,
or Christian representation, are progressively shed because you move beyond this kind of Wild West conception of the feudal era, where you actually have a formalization of the ruling class, right, which eventually becomes like the European, the same families that were governing it, everything. And because of that, it becomes less possible to associate a kind of radical otherness, with your enemy.
right,
They become largely symmetrical in terms of their rituals and the way they function. And then so tragedy becomes a way of understanding their folly or their flaw in a way within the context of symmetrical institutions. So it doesn't rely on the concept of the other person as being evil, right? It relies on the concept of the other person as being decisively flawed in some way, shape, or form. But I mean, like, I don't know, like, I just thought that was funny, right? Just like out of nowhere, right?
But it's also class. It's also social class. Social class
Yeah,
becomes the kind of determining point. He says the human becomes foreclosed in a Lacanian sense on 119. I like that.
yeah,
It's like
yeah.
there's like a scission of a foreclosure on that agential fetish or whatever, which actually opens up a lot of like that makes criticism possible in a certain way beyond, like I think he says it's something Northrop Frye couldn't see as well. Um Matilda, did you want to jump in?
Yes. Um, Thanks for the discussion, everybody. I was wondering about I like the Althusserian dictum that history is a process without telos or a subject, and I don't understand this quote, but I'm thinking about it seems like, okay, well, so I found a quote in the book where it says like that Jameson, he says that he reads this dictum in this spirit as a repudiation of master narratives and their twin categories of narrative closure as telos and of character as a subject of history. And so if history seems like it has, well, I'm curious if Althusser in his dictum would say like, I don't know what would stand in for telos, but it seems like history is history a process with an actant, like in the section on genre criticism where he talks about how like character is kind of like a cipher for different actants, and like one character can have like multiple actant functions. And if that's like a productive way of thinking about this quote from Althusser, what would narrative closure or telos be? Would it be like those functions that Prop talks about that perhaps like become elements of narrative closure or something? And so like potentially could we think of a way of thinking about this Althusserian phrase more concretely, like history is a process with narrative structures, but that have no purpose, no telos. So history is a process with narrative structures and actants. So to potentially make that just make more sense, potentially, I don't know if that's even productive to think about. And then to the questions of like good and evil, and I feel like Jameson comes down pretty hard on the point that Marx makes about Hegel in the 1844 manuscripts, that like Hegel is methodologically subjective, or like he thinks things in like subjective terms, not like collective ones. Like you see this, well, you see like I think Jameson thinks like ethical categories are methodologically like individualizing. And I think Jameson dislikes Fry's ordering of interpretation because the last level of Fry, manipulates the medieval forms of the 4 layers of interpretation and places at the very end one that kind of wraps the interpretation back into some like individualistic frame. And just to point out, it seems like Jameson thinks that Hegel is methodologically like individualizing. He has that same point about ethical thinking, and his criticism of Fry is kind of along those lines as well.
I just want to add, I would be about narrative. I think this is just an important distinction for Jameson's purposes. I don't think he wouldn't use the word, he wouldn't say that history has actual narratives as such, like, because narratives are always representational and projected onto the absent cause. So, I think part of the reason he's talking about, kind of actants and this kind of thing, right? It's like because he doesn't want to use, e.g., the language of subjects, right? And I think similarly, we could potentially speak of like causal mechanisms or patterns, right? But he wouldn't say there's actual narratives in history. He would say that there's, latencies within history that supply us with the material with which we would furnish narratives, right? If that.
Andrew, thank you, Matilda. That was really good.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Really good to see you all. Good to see you, Daniel and Conrad. Yeah, I found a really banger quote that he drops in 109, page 109, like the very bottom portion, where he really kind of succinctly like explains dialectical thinking. He says that dialectical thinking can be characterized as historical reflexivity, that is, as a study of an object, here romantic texts, which also involve the study of the concepts and categories. And then he just goes on. And I think this whole passage going up to the beginning of 110 is fire. But my question regarding that, because when he lays this out, he says that really what our process is to interrogate what he calls the antinomies of language. And then also that in this step, we have to depositivize these two positions, like, with a phenomenology or semiotics, it's like they're too positivized from his characteristic. And so dialectics is able to depositivize it. So I guess my question with regards to this dialectical thinking, is the antinomies of language the site of the, what he coins the ideologeme, or is it through there that we could arrive at the ideologeme? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I think that you need the semantic in order to identify how the ideologeme hollows out within a given text or whatever have you, because ultimately, it's a kind of Lacanian point, I think, really, that the ideologeme does not have a sort of transitive consistency for the community that invests in it, right? It's ultimately faulty, just as the master narrative would be thrown under suspicion. So the ideologeme would be as well. This structural versus semantic that he's playing with off of like Fry and Prop. Yeah, we didn't get into that too much, but I think that it's the means by which he's wanting to locate ideologemes. But when we get to Lord Jim and the analysis of Conrad, you will see the ideologemes in abundance. They're like I said, it allows you to take something from the political unconscious and then like put it to work. You could easily think of like performing your own forms of critique, seek to isolate an ideologeme. But I think that the way that you would do so would be based upon running it through the Gramscian square, right? And thinking about its binary logics. But I think the thing with the Gramscian square, I've been playing with them. Like if any novel that you do, I've noticed that you have to superimpose at least 4 or 5 onto, and it becomes quite ornate or like complicated. I don't know how to do them yet. I don't know if anybody knows how to do them really.
Well, I
Like I
will
know the
say,
concept of how to begin to do them, but I don't know how to sort of like, you see, this goes to Charles's point, right? Because this is a point about, what's dialectics after a binary operation has identified ideological closure. He wants to say something like dialectics kind of begins there. And then like you said, that passage, that then has to be historicized as well. So the ideology, I would say, is one of the points. It's extremely important in this text. Probably one of his most important concepts in this book, I would say, other than, the political unconscious itself and so on.
By
well,
the
I
way,
guess I
I
was
just
just
want to
gonna.
say,
Oh, sorry.
continue, Andrew, continue.
Okay, I was just gonna say because it kind of goes back, Daniel, and maybe you could chime in on this, Conrad. To the question I asked in the last session was regarding to the fact that okay, like the gray moss square isn't a dialectical thing, but like maybe you could say Jameson wants to dialectize the gray moss semiotic square, and I was like, maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but there's something interesting about when you look at the gray moss square. No matter your binary logic, what you start with, you have the contraries and contradictions, but then at the bottom you have the negate. Well, it's not that I wouldn't say like they say that, but it seems like in my language, it's like, okay, you got two negatives that meet as a contrary. So does something dialectical come out of that by historicizing with the gray moss square? So like,
No, no.
oh, okay.
What it is it's a point within a narrative that is then subsumed back into historical analysis. It's not necessarily, yeah, you have to do the work of this location of it in the context of a particular text, how it works with its emplotment, with its characters and setting and all of that. But then Marxism and dialectics allows us to link that to actual social contradictions and social forms. That's that whole transition from form and content that we talked about before, and how the text speaks to the social, right? So it's not purely isolated as a semantical linguistic thing at all. The semantic is thought with the structural, and then after this operation, it's thought dialectically vis-a-vis historical social forms, as I understand it.
I want to add as well about that I think it was interesting about your point about depositivization and dialectic. And I just wanted to say quickly, this is interesting about narrative and dialectic because it's important to remember that narrative is something that happens through time, right? So it's actually temporally dislocating, which is very, very important to the depositivizing aspect. I have more to say, but someone's banging at my door. I didn't expect this visit, so I'm going to deal with that, and I'll be back in a minute, okay?
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, okay. Charles says on 116, the conclusion seems unavoidable that we already have the ideal of a thinking being able to go beyond good and evil, namely the dialectic itself. Aha, yes. There you go. Yes, I remember that. Yeah. That I think is very essential because it's the Nietzschean solution is obviously not a dialectical solution to the aporia or to the binary of good and evil, but its merit is that like Nietzsche is a late romantic, right? He's working in a romance paradigm himself, and I think it's uh, yeah, he's the philosopher that helps us locate that antinomy that undergirds modern life or something like that. So, but then again, I don't know that dialectics here is as Hegelian as you'd like for it to be at all. I don't think that it is at all, which is fine. Do they have feds in China? Maybe they do. Yeah, it's possible. Yeah.
One of the weird thing to me, at least initially, he says when he talks about genres transcending the ethical, or what is second? The yeah. And he brings up tragedy and it says that the ethical is wholly absent. And I just immediately thought of both in Hegel and Marx, you have this tragic situation that pops up for like right in the master slave dialectic, for example, in the phenomenology, the slave seems to realize the situation in a way that the master doesn't, because he is struck with fear and it, in an authentic way vibrates through his entire existence. And Hegel says that he has experienced the absolute Flüssigwerden alles Bestehens, which is the absolute fluidification or melting away of everything stable. Okay. Now, what's weird about that is that in a tragic way, the idea of fate, which Jameson brings up, because here this absolute fluidification in the master-slave dialectic, it just is the real thing, but the slave is an immature consciousness. It can't see itself in that. And so it experiences this real thing as this fate, as this absolute Flüssigwerden. So in a way, in this dialectic, the ethical is present, but as an alien fate. And then, of course, in Marx, we see the kind of horrific situation where capital itself becomes a real thing, a fate in the world that usurps what we think of as normal people or normal human Gattungswesen or genus being. It becomes this monstrous thing, like a fate in the world. And so that, in both senses, there's a kind of tragedy there, but the ethical seems to be dislocated from itself.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't seem to be wholly absent in that tragedy. So I was kind of wondering where he was going.
Yeah, I mean, it does remind us that in the communist, the quote about the ethical as it pertains to Marx and Engels, historicized is a reference to Communist Manifesto, where the idea here is dialectics as sublation of an element of the progressive bourgeoisie. In other words, there's an admission and a recognition that Marxism in its classical period, right, is a doctrine that would both see the necessity for the destruction of the good of the bourgeois while also retaining an element of that good, right? And I think that the Nietzschean and the Althusserian, although of course they're very distinct forms of dealing with ethics, you're right, they're presenting something that is of the status of a non-agential otherness. That's why the problem of otherness itself comes so proximal in ethics as he ends this section here. I do find this section quite powerful. And I agree with you that his reading of Hegel is a bit off. I don't know if Conrad wanted to jump in, then we could go to Akshay, or if you're still tied
Yeah,
up.
I would say so about this issue. I think maybe on some level, what you're reacting to is the fact that because the real issue I think that you're expressing concern with here is the fact that unlike Hegel or many interpretations of Marx, um, Jameson follows Althusser in separating validity and values in that way. And there will be criticisms of this, right? So Gillian Rose, for example, criticizes Althusserianism as a rerun of neo-Kantianism, right? Because of the way that it imposes this partition upon the work. But yeah, you can make the argument that this sort of attempt to separate out ethics, if you will, right? From, say, the absent cause of history, or to place dialectics on the side of narrative, and thus a kind of necessary ideological dimension, that there's something lost in translation with respect to the originary content of Hegel or such and such. So I think there's quite a bit.
I would also want to say one thing. I would say that, one of the Althusserian legacies that has happened apropos ethics, and I wrote about this in my own dissertation, is what we call the political suspension of the ethical. And I would contend that Jameson may be operating in this mode of thinking the political in what is often referred to as pre-political, right? And so we see this in Leclau, We see this in a lot of post-Marxism, whereby the ethical is only thought after a rupture of the political in a given situation. In other words, the ethical, Charles, is not immediately what is available, embedded in sociality as such. The ethical is a secondary dialectical movement that emerges after something political happens. So,
Actually, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just, I guess, like in this passage also the word that's sort of sticking out to me is sort of genre, and I guess like because I mean I think a lot of the time when Benjamin right, interesting slip, but I mean in the sense that when Jameson is talking about genre or tragedy, I don't think he means like, I mean sometimes he means tragedy, all of it, but sometimes I think he means tragedy, the genre of like, you know, writing or poetry. And like, I think he does engage a lot with Benjamin and, you know, his sort of idea of like the Trauerspiel, right? Like, and like what changes in the sort of modern notion of tragedy as opposed to the Greek one. And what changes is sort of that the modern one is supposed to, you're supposed to be apathetic, right? Like the modern viewer is supposed to like grimdark, you know, they enjoy Game of Thrones. Like they see the vulgarity of the world and they're not sort of fazed by it. I mean, and so on the one hand, there's this entire argument about genre itself as a way of like, as a form, like organizes, you know, the contents of any given narrative. So like, there isn't just tragedy as such. There's always like historically determinate, you know, tragedy for whom, where, when. Um, and I think like looking at the science fiction books, I think is really helpful in this regard because like a lot of the argument is again like what is unique about the genre of science fiction as compared to say fantasy or I mean not fantasy but something like an epic, right? Like or magical realism or sort of. And I think for him it has a lot to do with this like the real impact of science on the popular imagination. And you know, so like when someone reads a sentence like, oh, the ground vanished beneath their feet, like in a sort of pre-scientific universe, that can only have like a metaphorical, allegorical kind of meaning. But in science fiction, you're meant to read it like literally, you know, the ground literally vanished, or like we know when Douglas Adams says like they destroyed the earth to make way for a highway. It's not a metaphor, right? Like in a anyway, what I mean to say is like there's a totally new form, which is like a totally new form of narrativization, and that has sort of political effects, right? Like which aren't, um, yeah. So I mean, I think that's what is going on with the whole thing about tragedy.
Yeah, and for Jameson, and you know, often he'll invoke science fiction, and it has an importance to him also because of the way that we already said this. It's like that, you know, there for Jameson there is a kind of you know, teleological element which is real in the sense that, you know, he doesn't deny the possibility that futures can be contained within the present, right? But I said this before, he has a kind of multi-form reading of it. So in other words, this doesn't mean that it's teleological in the sense it will arc necessarily in one direction, because there are multiple modes of production embedded within the present, right, that are in conflict with one another, right? So the significance of science fiction in that context would be the way that it could actually generate a kind of speculative posit with respect to how that might play out if, you know, a particular mode of production, you know, or expression of it acquires hegemony over the other, and so on and so forth, right? By the way, I want to recommend you quickly a great book on the speculative and philosophical potential of science fiction. It's Fluid Futures by Stephen Shaviro.
oh yeah.
So uses Deleuzian categories in that, but I read through that. And if you're interested in this topic, the philosophical potential of science fiction, I think it's a good one. But I wanted to shift. I wanted to ask you kind of a question, Daniel, that has to do with, and this was related to a point I wanted to make, which has to do with cultural Marxism, because I wondered how you were defining that and how you were relating it to Jameson, because it seems to me that one thing about Jameson is that, you know, while he values the cultural, right, he also has a strong sense of the significance of economic determination, right? So we see this, for example, you know, in his analysis of postmodernism, where like the principal kind of function of it is to, ground this in kind of an adapted rendition of Mendel's conception, of late capitalism. So, we have this impossibility to map the world system, right? That manifests in kind of the epistemic dislocation characteristic of postmodernism. Because I would kind of see, and I understand how Jameson can be subsumed to that label, which, again, I'm not sure about to what extent cultural Marxism is used within scientific discourses as a label. I know I Googled it, and the first thing that came up was a far-right conspiracy theory because I was Googling to kind of see. But yeah, I wondered about this because as I would see it, I would situate the weakness of Jameson a little bit elsewhere, or maybe just more specifically, I don't know, in the sense that I think part of the problem with Jameson, so part of what we see is that, he talks about uh, Adorno's conception of totality, right? In late Marxism, for example, right? And he makes the argument that, well, like Adorno denied the possibility of capacities for resistance, right? Even, and this was like even why in the 1960s he was so skeptical about the potential of the student movement, for example, right? And he was very skeptical about anti-colonial movements at that time, right? And Jameson, looking on from the standpoint of neoliberalism and Reagan and Thatcher and so forth, Jameson basically says, well, perhaps Adorno did that prematurely, right? But today we can say that we really see this like global enclosure of capitalism, right? And I think this creates the problem that this creates is that Jameson's aware enough of economic determination that he's conscious of the breadth of that system, right? But then that raises the question of like how do you resist within a totalized model, right? And then I think, he didn't come up with a lot of like it's usually sort of passing. And we know that, we know in his writings he'll say things like, well, American, libertarian Marxists should read Engels on authority, because it gives you the sense of, so he was fond of doing that. But I think if we look at one of the few texts where he does offer a more positive political formulation, right, which would be in American Utopia, right, this sort of essay in which he argues that potentially the military could expand and sprawl globally, and it functions outside the limitations of the marketplace, therefore could become a kind of social institution capable of creating a different sort of
Right.
political
Right.
reality. I'm just going to say about that, like, but this, like, but when he does that, he's very clear, right, that he's like, this is an essentially utopian gesture, right? And even mentions people like Fourier. And Jodi Dean will critique this, right? Because she says that this is like so remote from reality, and even says like there'll be machines that kind of do everything. It's really not. It's indicative of his own unwillingness to do political philosophy, let alone to really produce a tangible political program. So I think that in a way, with that totality conceptualized, the only gesture left, is a kind of leap into utopia that would be unsatisfying by virtue of its very nature, right? So I'm asking you at that level, like, how are you using cultural Marxism there, and how do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about cultural Marxism has to do with this idea of the politicization of the cultural
Mhm.
as a unique um, replacement or unthought, because you see, we have a rich presentation of the political, but the matrices of how the political is defined here is not inclusive of political Marxism, right? And this goes into the core of my work, which is a wrestling with the legacy of post-Althusserian Marxism and its abandonment, I think, of so many core political Marxist categories of analysis and a practice. On the one hand, on the other hand, the idea of cultural revolution at the end of the first chapter, I find explosive and interesting as this non-synchronous object that can be sort of located as a point of imminent criticism and all of that. But at the same time, I'm wondering what this has actually, when I say cultural Marxism, this is sort of what I'm getting at, which is this sort of grand historical shift, a tectonic plate shift, we could say, whereby the end of 68, right, whereby the assault on Stalinism is now itself breeding a certain reactionary leftism, a sensorial leftism, a leftism that's totally lost to itself, a leftism that's fighting ghosts of the past that are no longer like commensurate with our reality. So this is what I mean by that. I don't mean it as a dog whistle. I mean as the excessive politicization of the cultural. Now, you could say, of course, that's like reading Jameson as an effect of his text, or sort of like reading him as a symptom of his moment. What do I mean by that
Yeah.
also? What I mean by that also is that, yeah, comp lit departments in America, after the success of Frederick Jameson, were eager to define themselves as Marxists, but on the basis of this enlarged cultural revolutionary mandate, right? And thereby liquidating a lot of historical Marxist categories. So, that's one point. I think the other point would be I'm myself more than willing to go beyond a comfortable ecumenical rapprochement with post-structuralism and enter into the position that actually post-structuralism, by valorizing the fragmentation of society, is actually contributing to something quite harmful. And it should actually not be valorized, right? Like that. Whereas Jameson is absolutely indifferent to that. It's absolutely indifferent to that. And that is, by the way, that is where, a shift occurs, where we see in thinkers from Lasch to McIntyre, not a reactionary position, but like something like an embrace of tradition, or let's engage theology, or like we need to open up a new tradition hermeneutic that Marxism cannot. So it is going back to that. The use of cultural Marxism, I say as a polemical, as a provocative thing, but I think that there's some truth to it. I think that there is some truth to the politicization of that domain. But please fire back. I mean, please.
Okay, but right. But is it I mean, first of all, when it comes to postmodernism, right? Like, why this is Marx, all that's solid melts into air, right? That's what he's describing, right? He's describing the way that the transformations, characteristic of late capitalism, right, have generated a kind of fragmentation of public consciousness, right? And obviously, as Marx says, all patriarchal feudal idyllic traditions are, dispensed with, right? Now, we know if we look at the retention of past modes of production and so on, it's not that simple. But the point is, why would he oppose that as such? I mean, he's clearly in favor of like a Marxist resolution of that, right? But it would seem strange,
I'll tell you why.
right?
I'll tell you why it's strange, because he's making linkages to non-synchronous forms of reified, alienated social forms as linked to praxis. That's the problem that we have. It's that linkage itself which becomes a bit mercurial, or lost in something imprecise, perhaps. But that itself, I think you're right, points to the ambiguity of Jameson as such, which is he's torn on that problem, and I think I respect him for being torn on it. I think more Marxists in the academy should be torn on that, but more Marxists in the only way to be torn on that, I think, is to have your foot in actual Marxist practice work and so on, socialist work, working class work, etc. Right? Otherwise, I think we run the risk of theorizing post-structuralist forms of liberation vis-a-vis libertarian liberalism in a certain way, unbeknownst ideologically. So I should have said libertarian liberalism as opposed to cultural Marxism, perhaps. But that's sort of what I'm driving home at here.
But it's interesting also because, as I've said before, he's actually written on the tendency of libertarian Marxism in the United States. And he attributes this to a kind of fantasy that arises from, the lack of capitalist enclosure within the early United States. As well as like the experience of things like, communes, a lot of which were set up in the United States and everything. And he has attributed to it, the existence of like a deficit of political collectivism as well as political realism in the United States. But I mean, like, so Jameson's a literary critic, right? So he's talking about texts. I mean, that's inevitable. But if we really look at, what he's actually saying, like, even if we look at a concept like cultural revolution, right? Well, what does cultural revolution entail, right? I mean, it's talking about culture, of course, but in what way is it talking? He's talking about the cultural shifts that accompany changes between modes of production, right? And as we know, and as Jameson would acknowledge, when we're talking about modes of production, we're going to be talking about social classes, right? The capitalist mode of production and the bourgeois social class, right? The proletariat and Marxism, right? Or socialism, as it were, right? So I understand what you're saying sort of at the level of affect, like Jameson wrote in a very dense style. He obviously assimilated the language of post-structuralism. He talks a lot about text. He's a literary critic. But I do feel like, and I want to insist on this, I do feel like, going back to, the fact, and a lot of this, I think, just has to do with how old he is, right? Because, his heritage, right? Writing about Sartre, in the Cold War, right? I do feel like there is this very vintage kind of Marxist-Leninist element to Jameson too that surfaces often within the text. I mean, you're aware of some of the ambiguities and you've raised them too. So just want to make that point.
Thank you very much. No, it's a good debate. It's a very I mean, it's like the debate that I have on the podcast all the time, right? And there's like a super vulgar way to go about this, and just keep this in mind. I am pressured a lot by these like Chibber, Catherine Liu type academics to be way more critical on this issue than I am. And I actually am kicking around a review on some of these things because there are some symptomatic points that are reflective of a milieu of a pluralistic, let's call it that, or ecumenical form of Marxism that was just blossoming. And the funny thing about that form of Marxism that Jameson is engaging with at this moment is that itself, it is so much more. And maybe this is just owed to like Jameson's just a mastery, but perhaps like we don't read great academic texts like the political unconscious anymore. Maybe I don't know. Like that's something. By the way, speaking of texts, Conrad, Christopher wants you to link the Stephen Shaviro text in the chat.
Okay.
Aaron, please jump in.
Yeah, I had a quick question that was sort of tangential to this, but it's about this thing that's been raised throughout the session about the overlapping modes of production and kind of how they're tied to this third level of the Jamesonian kind of framework, which
the
is
non-synchronous, right?
Yeah, and I was curious, this is kind of insider baseball for some of the newer members of the group, and so I'm sorry about that. But when I was reading that, it was very interesting to me because Jameson, the very kind of like the picture he paints in terms of them being overlapping, he calls them archaic structures. And he says, for instance, that like patriarchy and what does he say here? It's at the bottom of 99 and then it carries on to 100. Oh, this is the language I was looking for. So sexism and the patriarchal are to be grasped as the sedimentation and the virulent survival of forms of alienation specific to the oldest mode of production of human history. He then goes on and says, the formal persistence of such archaic structures of alienation and the sign system specific to them beneath the overlay of all the more recent and historically original types of alienation, such as political domination and commodity reification, etc. But what I found interesting about that is that he's making a kind of binary between those older archaic structures and then newer kind of capitalist forms of alienation. And I thought for those of us that were in the kind of Lasordo groups, I found it very interesting that like for Lasordo, these forms of patriarchy, etc., are not sedimented or kind of leftover or traces or something like this, but they're integrated within the capitalist division of labor itself, and they
Yeah.
play a specific role within the capitalist sort of mode of production rather than being
And that allows Lacerda, by the way, to address emancipation as recognition struggle, i.e., what it's not only feminism, it's Black liberation too. It's the legacy of chattel slavery, right? It's also that. And I feel that Lacerda, perhaps one of his merits, is that he's more readily able to have a sort of solution to the, and maybe you could say there is something like the a latent influence of Althusser on his thinking. We've already pointed that out multiple times in past sessions, and I think actually I haven't got around to carefully studying the early text that he wrote on the state. Conrad, have you finished a read of that yet?
I haven't got through that yet. I've
Okay.
been
Okay.
really busy with other stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would look forward to doing that. Maybe we can talk about that in the future on the Archimedean point.
Yeah. Could I jump in on this issue on
Sure.
social formation and motive production? Yeah. So to be clear, and to be clear, starting with, like, about Jameson, he acknowledges it to be both, right? So he acknowledges it to be simultaneously residual and active and reconfigured, as he would say, within capitalism. I want to make a point here just before continuing, which is that this idea of social formation as involving different modes of production existing and simultaneously, that idea, though most associated with Althusser and apparent in Poulantzas. Actually, there was an essay on this in HM I read. I forget the author, but there was an essay that dealt with this. Maybe I can dig it up if people are curious. But it actually sources this to a quote by Marx. So it seems that Marx had the same usage at some point in his output. So I think that's just something that people might find interesting. But the problem I have with this, though, and this is why I actually, if you read The Social Formation of the Far Right, this is why I actually do away with this, at least for the purposes of my, relatively short, compared to this book essay, which is that the problem I see is that you end up like, I think the thesis of residuality ends up being unnecessarily diachronic in certain ways. And I say that because often you get into these like ridiculous conversations where it's like, of course we can say, there are modes of production integrated into our society that have an older heritage. But it turns into this really funny discussion where people are like, oh, taxes. That's like
Right.
tributary mode of production, right? Or
Right.
what past mode of production do you attribute the patriarchal family, right? Do you go back to, the
Right, but
gems
also
of the kinship society? Like
there's an
what I
there's an
mean is that
analytical problem, but there's also a political
yeah,
problem, right? Because like if they're properly sedimented, I mean, this leaves you very little political option in terms of like he says at one point after that passage that I read that like we would have to overthrow the kind of capitalist mode of production, but then we would also have to go back further and but what does it mean to overthrow kind of the residue of tribal society or something like this? I mean, like
Right.
it doesn't really, for me, it's a kind of political impossibility. I don't even know what that would mean, let alone whether it's analytically accurate or philosophically accurate or something along those lines. But when I was reading that, it was very, I found, I mean, I had a lot of problems with the Lacerda reading when we were doing it, but like materially, like sort of locating those forms of domination within a capitalist division of labor, to me seems, if not more philosophically convincing, at least politically actionable in a way that like what I'm getting from Jameson here leaves me it's just an open question for me, if that makes sense.
Well,
Sorry to cut you off.
it also evokes this idea of archaic as tied to his theory of libidinal transfiguration. So this kind of goes back to cultural revolution, right? Which is, we're still in the wake of this 68 theory of revolution where the libidinal mass has this ecstatic, expressive revolt. And I feel that Jameson is valorizing that. And that's fine. I'm not saying we shouldn't valorize that. I'm just saying that we've lived in the wake of the absolute capture by liberal power of libidinal revolt, very, very much. And if there's not a sober reckoning of that fact, we would live in some type, because this is like where romance enters into bad utopianism, in my opinion, and like where this psycho like naivete of the like where even some critics of the Cultural Revolution in the West, like Philip Reef, like have a little bit of a point, in my opinion, if we're not sober to questions of state capture and power and political party power capture, etc. Um, and you're also right. That's like, yeah, there's it's begging for a theory of the subject. Yeah, great question, Aaron. You like really brought out a essential fucking point.
Let me
Please
just
jump
jump in
in, and
again
then
on
Matilda.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, by the way, Aaron, I agree with most of what you're saying, and I think it's a really good point. Um, for me, the issue would not be the postulation of a kind of historicity as such, which I think would have a lot of validity. It would be the point at which, because like, it would be the point at which residuality becomes a kind of spiritual overtone, right? That thereby circumscribes the limitations of political practice in that way. So, like I think this is I in social formation of the far right, again, I analyze this, but I get very frustrated when you hear this sort of, and I think it's often associated with kind of cultural and liberal discourse, but where it's like, well, even if we abolished capitalism, we would still need like 1,000 years to abolish patriarchy or something like that. And it's like, why? Like it's like, because if that is incorporated within capitalism, right? The family, right, as a unit of production and consumption, and then we get rid of that and we get rid of, that the way that the delegation of the wage unequally vis-a-vis social reproductive labor and all of that. If we get rid of that, then why would it continue? Because like you can look at actual examples of societies in the not so recent past, right? Like if you look at, I think Albania, I like to use this as an example, right? Which was like basically a kind of, very poor, right? Sort of illiterate, largely Muslim society, at the interstices of kind of Italian and Greek colonization, right? And then you had in World War II, right? You had the communist movement come to power, right? Enver Hoxha and so on. And you had a socialist economy, and they were basically compelling women who had, e.g., good grades to go into like science and engineering fields, which was characteristic of a lot of socialist societies. But in Albania, they were even more emphatic. So, if a woman got good grades and she was like, "Oh, I want to be a teacher," they'd be like, "No, you're going to be an engineer," right? Um, and today, according to some studies, even all these years after the collapse of the socialist regime, Albania has the highest rate of women's workplace integration on the entire planet. No, I'm not saying that they've abolished patriarchy or anything like that, right? I'm saying like that is an astonishing leap for society to have made in a few decades, right? And that was made, based on these sort of fundamental restructurations that affected, both the family, and the capitalist economy as such. So I don't see a lot of evidence in our actual historical experience that, that there's this sort of spiritual residuum that, is truly resistant to political practice. But I do think it's very convenient for certain people to say that, right? Because I think that, if you look at the tendency of our society now, it's like we conceptualize feminism as kind of like, okay, um, you know, have equal female CEOs, go in, get your education, do your work, but we don't think about social reproductive labor, right? It's that whole discourse around social reproductive labor is largely like invisibilized within modern economic discourses, right? How would we ever do away with the family? So in that context, it's convenient to suggest this thesis of a spiritual residuum because it makes it seem like, oh, we're doing the best we can. Everything's good. It's just a spiritual residue that's very hard to get rid of. Right. So I just reject really strongly this whole discourse of this sort of residue. But that having been said, and it is clear that, these simultaneous modes of production, if you will, have diverse and different histories, and that has to be accounted for. I just don't want to mystify it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Matilda, please.
You're muted.
You are muted,
So-
Saryam.
I'm still puzzling over that point about schizophrenic subject, because like if I can just read a like the concluding sentence of that paragraph, he says just before that, we may admit the descriptive value of the post-structuralist critique of the subject without necessarily endorsing the schizophrenic ideal it has tended to project. For Marxism, indeed, only the emergence of a post-individualistic social world, only the reinvention of the collective and the associative can concretely achieve the decentering of the individual subject called for by such diagnoses. Only a new and original form of collective social life can overcome the isolation and monadic autonomy of the older bourgeois subjects in such a way that individual consciousness can be lived and not merely theorized as an effective structure. And then he puts Lacan in parentheses right after that, which I guess like, on the one hand, it seems to be saying that the bourgeois subject perhaps repress different forms of subjectivity that might have been related to more archaic modes of production that were collective and associative. I mean, there's that whole line of thinking about communism as like the fulfillment of this, like we started in communism and then we went through this history of alienation only to, be able to reappropriate it more fully. Going back into like that, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there was something very satisfying about that form of subjectivity that we lost that was archaic. But then on the other hand, it seems like he's saying that that this.
And keep in mind the reference to Lacan there is intentionally against the idea of the reunification of mother, because psychoanalytically, as you know, Lacan is known to be opposed to this fusional model of reconciliation with the symbolic mother, i.e. with primitive communism. Right?
That is certainly a part of his, yes, but so I'm puzzled, so I am puzzled still over how to read this last clause. So a new and original collective social life can overcome the isolation in such a way that the individual consciousness can be lived as an effective structure. It sounds like that individual consciousness that is that can be lived as an effective structure sounds like schizophrenia, perhaps. Like consciousness is decentered in a certain way, or like the bourgeois subject is like retained but decentered in such a way that it's not naturalized as like the natural form of the subject. It's like one possible mode of subjectivity, perhaps. Going back into that schizophrenic ideal as having multiple modes to like perform from or something. I'm not sure, because I mean, I read an effective structure to be something, structure is something that seems to be anarchic. That's how I read this word. It's without purpose, without telos, without closure, an effective structure, one of many structures, perhaps, or something. So it does seem like there would be something liberating about schizophrenia, according to Jameson.
Yeah, I think so too.
But Jameson
I think that's a
rejects, to be
problem.
clear,
But we'd have to judge it against like Marxism more broadly from like Bloch. I wonder if Bloch thinks that schizophrenia is an ideal. Bloch and Benjamin certainly had very strange ideas about tribal societies and idealizing them in certain ways. I haven't read a lot of him.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. I just meant to say that I think earlier in the text, Jameson, he talks about the relationship to Deleuze, right? And he says that my analysis would share something in common with Deleuze, because I don't take for granted, as it were, right? The sort of symbolic codifications, right? That the material of reality is exposed to, right? So I think he mentions the Oedipus complex, right? And anti-Oedipus being a really important one. But he also says that, but I believe he says I would be different because I also understand that we need to symbolically codify reality this way. In other words, he's not running toward like an unshackled conception of desire in that way, right? That's going to lead Deleuze and Guattari down the same path. So there's a sort of Kantian gesture there, in a sense, or really Hegelian, right? In this, or a defense of, a more classical style of German philosophy, in the sense that, the negativity of reality is acknowledged, and then the need to, place it within these to place it within these different interpretive prisms, right? And I think that what he's worried about with these concepts of Deleuze and Guattari, right, is what he calls immanence, right? The problematic of immanence, right? Because for Jameson, a kind of transcendence is necessary, right? He doesn't believe that you're just going to be able to access something in and of itself. And at times he'll actually analogize, post-structuralism to like new criticism in this way, or like close reading, right? Because he classifies it as like a deficit of the symbolic, right? But then insists upon the necessity of the symbolic at that level. But then if we insist upon the necessity of the symbolic, it's like which symbolic? What codes are we using at that level? Now, on a dialectical level, of course, we could say that, if you're disassembling, right, categories or prisms of interpretation that are outmoded, right, or impede your understanding, then that could be a good thing, right? But then the question is the fundamental directionality, right? Is that something we're doing in order to create new categories, right? Or is that something we're doing, in the whole, within this sort of messianic frame of, oh, we're going to realize a world that's imminent, right? In that way. Does that help at all, Matilda?
Yeah.
It does.
I could say a few things as well. I mean, one thing we didn't mention that's an important thing to flag is the concept of the generic, which is what realism does, right? Realism is interesting because it allows for it has what he calls a strategic value, because it allows us to locate a generic concept that speaks to like an existent social form, right? So, for example, we'll see this in Balzac, is that all of Balzac, you could say, sort of like culminates in an object of a meditation on the future of social life. And so there's like this, but that has a cathartic effect on the reader as much as it has a weapon for the critic, right? So realism has this. You can see immediately why it's deployable for a Marxist end. I did appreciate the footnote about Lukács and Solzhenitsyn. Did you guys see that? Are you aware of this whole thing? Are you aware of it? It's a pretty good thing for Lukács, which is that, Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, the expose on Stalinism, which is most famous, and all of the liberals celebrated as the sort of sine qua non example of the horrors of Stalinism. Lukács fully endorsed it being published and was in favor of that, by the way. And then I think Jameson does recognize that with Solzhenitsyn, we see the decline of realism also, as an interesting political point. So realism seems to simply coincide also with the collapse of really existing socialism in a certain way, which in a way is interesting, because when we talk about um, late capitalism, right, as a structuring of space and as what Marx called the world market, right, in later Jameson work, right, um, we don't talk as much about post-structuralism, because post-structuralism was born from anti-Marxism. But if Marxism as a social form also collapses, so does post-structuralism. I think that's important to note. Connor, please.
Yeah, what's up, everybody? I kind of just wanted to talk a little bit more about like schizophrenia. And sort of like humming in the background of this is Jameson's affinity for like affect theory. And this is related then to this coextensive modes of production. Earlier Aaron left now, but he was talking about like, how is it that we sort of like, how might we like challenge patriarchy or something like this? Or we could ask the same question about these earlier modes of production as well. Capitalism is already doing that work. This is what, everything that's solid melts into air exactly means. It's just the incorporation of earlier social formations into capitalism that gets rid of tradition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this thing gets to schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a subjective formation appropriate to a certain period in capitalism, really appropriate to like sort of like monopoly capitalism, really. And this is then also tied to what Jameson talks about elsewhere as the waning of the subject. Barthes likes to talk about this. This would probably then be the mode of subjectivity more appropriate to realism, wherein things like, wise. So in other words, then the waning of the subject is the waning of the bourgeois subject, which is appropriate to a mode of capitalism where competition is actually something that you could do. You could egotistically put your self-interest consciously in front of your mind and, actually do something. That's no longer possible in monopoly capitalism. So then the subject is not able to affect their life. And schizophrenia then is a mode of subjectivity appropriate in adapting to that situation, but crucially in a way that does not allow for them to cohere in a way that they can relate to other people. So it's isolating, it's immobilizing for the subject. And thus, like, the thing then that's interesting for Jameson is that it is progressive insofar as losing a sense of one's subjectivity and egoism. This can lend itself to collective formation. So we see like a sort of collective subject in utero here, but it's not, again, able to cohere. And yeah, so I just mean to point out then that this like coextensive mode of production stuff, how do we challenge it? The task is really to accelerate it, to further develop the means of production. But this is just classic socialism stuff, right? Yeah, that was just a little riff. So
Thank you.
With respect to what you're saying, your point about monopoly capitalism and schizophrenia is well taken. I just want to say about all that solid melts into air. So we have to be really, really careful with this, because the problem is that it doesn't account for the way that what you're terming here past modes of production, or we could say aspects of capitalism that are exogamous to the exploitation of commodified labor power, might be another way of putting it. It doesn't account for the way that these actually subsume and repurpose, forms of patriarchy, or sort of retrograde aspects, right? So, if we look at the family, for example, right? You can argue that there's a employment of it within capitalism that is every bit as bad, maybe some would argue worse, someone like Federici, than what came before, because, when you have a society where men are principally delegated the wage and social reproductive labor is not wage, right? Then that allots like a tremendous power, right, to the wage earner who's characteristically male, right? We can see a lot of examples, right? In terms of slavery in the United States, for example, the way that, in the South, that it became enclosed within the circuits of capital, which is why you needed this kind of, I'm not, obviously it wasn't outside the economy, but it's why you needed a political war, right? To bring slavery to an end, right? Because it wasn't just ending itself, right? Now, we could look at through another prism and say, well, it ended. So capitalism, okay, got rid of, but it's not, this is very, very complicated when we break this down. But this is connected to changes within the very thought of Marx and Engels, right? Because, even if you look at something like imperialism, right, or colonialism, right, we see a progressive shift in their attitude whereby in their earlier work, they tended to believe that this would sort of bring about, I'm not going to say non-agonistically, but kind of bring about, the spread of modernization throughout the world, and kind of generate the conditions for sort of global communism. Of course, later we see them becoming more and more skeptical and beginning to lend their support to tangible, anti-imperialist movements, right, in places like Poland and Ireland and so on. And this is kind of, I don't want to say, oh, it's just that they were bad chauvinists. I think this has to do with the increasing apparency with which, um, you know, um, imperialism was actually restraining the development of a lot of countries, right? So they're being transformed into, exporters of primary resources, right? They weren't industrializing, right? Living conditions were atrocious. I think 40 million Indians died within as many years of British rule in the late 19th and early 20th century. And this anticipates, of course, Lenin's position, which is like a full-throated support for anti-imperialism, because at that time it was possible to observe that,
Right.
there needed to be a political war, right, to end that, in order to create like a new basis or foundation for development. So I just wanted to add that I think that that issue is just super complex on that level, but
Okay, well, I think we'll close here and we will meet next week. I know it's a lot of reading. And Connor is going to have a few remarks as well. And I know that Conrad will have remarks, and everyone else is welcome to have remarks as well. But Connor's a huge Jamesonian scholar, so happy to invite him to make some remarks as well. Um, Great. Really enjoying it, everyone. Thank you so much for your time, for your insights, for your questions. Is there anybody that had a burning thought before we bounce? Julie, do you have any thoughts before we leave?
I have an anecdote.
Okay, let's hear it.
So I was at the library today, and this little girl comes up to me and says, "Can you help me find a book?" And I said, "Of course." And I said, "What type of book would you like? What do you want to read?" And she said, "Romance." And I was like, oh shit, what am I gonna do? And so I pulled Little Women off the shelf and I said, this is a good romance. It's got two sisters, they fight over the same guy. You'll love it. And she looked at it, made a face at me like this, and said, that's a lot of words on a lot of pages. And then just walked away.
That's amazing. I thought it was going to be, if it was an adult, you could have handed the adult the Communist Manifesto. They're like, how is that romance? Oh, well, let me tell you, there's this literary critic named Frederick Jameson, and Marxism is romance, in fact. So
I thought the little girl was actually going to say that she wanted to read The Political Unconscious, and that was going to be the anecdote.
I have
nice.
I have one thing I wanted, just like a question to propose. Like, it seemed like that part on like Westerns, and then like finally like in the feudal period, how there's like warring factions, and then finally there's like kind of this like fusion point. I felt like the modern reference that came to my head was like Luke Skywalker pulling off the helmet of Darth Vader
Mm.
as like the reconciliation moment when like there's a class hegemony that has formed. I know it's just such a kind of a trope bad, but I mean, I feel like I wonder, I mean, and that's like Jameson's writing like immediately in that moment, I suppose. And I just wonder what that could mean about, is it a global class hegemony, or is this like an American, class hegemony that's formed, because like the Western, it's like, it kind of dies by the 60s, and then, there's, yeah, just something to think about. I don't know.
Thanks, guys. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, do give me, if you can, over Discord, thoughts of people that you might want to engage. We should start thinking about who we want to talk about Jameson. We've kind of mentioned a few people, but maybe there's people to, because there's still quite a lot to go through. We're not even halfway done. Uh-oh. Yeah, we're not halfway done, but that's okay. It's just getting better. Although that first chapter was a fucking hell of a lot. I was even thinking like that is like comparable to like the preface to the phenomenology of spirit in a way, just in terms of like its magnitude in a certain way. Maybe not. Okay. Anna Kornblum. Yes, that's a good idea. Thank you guys. So hard to say goodbye. You guys are the greatest.